Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video view series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. For this video, I'll be reviewing the supplement The Babbling Wizard's Guide to Reality by Babbling Wizard for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. This review has been sponsored by the publisher, and a review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. A limited time discount voucher has also been provided. You can click on the link below to get 20% off your purchase. The offer ends in 1 week on December 18th. Any purchases you make with my affiliate links also help support my work, and you can support me via patreon.com/roguewatson. So the Guide to Reality is a supplement that aggregates a lot of existing content from 5e books, the Monster Manual, the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Essentials Kit, the Starter Kit, Xanathar's, Mordenkainen's, Volo's, the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide. Over the years, we've had a lot of books released, and this basically takes a lot of the existing tables that already mostly exist within the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide, and mostly just updates them to include things like new spells from Xanathar's and new monsters. The usefulness is limited. Thankfully, it does get better when it comes to the encounter tables, and we'll get to that later on, but I was kind of fooled by the fact that it's over 150 pages long, but it is mostly tables, so that makes the pages go by very, very quickly. And I think most of these parts, it's of limited use in an age where the internet exists, and we can just look up all this information fairly easily. I mean, yes, it is nice to have some of these things at a glance, to be able to look at, okay, what are all the playable races as of 2020 that includes all the new monstrous races in Volos and the new sub races that were introduced in the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide. Like, yes, that can be useful to have at a glance, but none of this is new information. It's just taking information that exists and putting them in their own tables that you can look at. And for some folks, maybe this book would be more useful than trying to search online, or if you've got some go-to websites that do this, I can see that. And this is designed to be a living document, which means the designer will essentially release patches and updates at free cost. Obviously, you've already owned the document, and update it to include new content as they release. For example, this does not include any content from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, because that was at the time of this review and the release of this product. Tasha's had just come out, I think, mere weeks ago. So the designer does say that they'll be plugging in that new content into this document. So that's pretty useful. But again, the usefulness will determine on how much you need this information presented in this format. I do think that part 1 is particularly weirdly unattractive with how it looks like, especially with the spells. And, the designer does include these kind of purple tables, which look fine. That's a decent way of doing it together, and obviously including the resource where you can find that information, like XJTE is Xanathar's Guide to Everything, for example. But the actual spells just looks like a long-ass list, kind of like an index, and it's not very attractive. It's very small font. There's no, color bars or anything to kind of help differentiate things. At the very least, if you're going to make this in an index style, then just go full-on index and include the page number I can actually find these spells on. That would be pretty useful, rather than flipping open the book and trying to search, alphabetically and find it. If you want to have this open just with the page number, that could at least save some time. But honestly, I'm just going to Google search the damn spell. Now, I'm playing on VTT, so it's easy for me to use the computer for literally everything. So something like this isn't super helpful. But if you're playing on a table, then maybe having a document would help. Although, hopefully you've printed the latest copy, or you've got it on a digital, tablet anyway, so you can get those updates, because 5e is still a kickin' and still has plenty of content being released, as we just saw with Tasha's. I reached out to the designer on one question about, and I haven't heard back at the time of this review, on why some of the 5e book content wasn't included and others were. Namely, so this does include all of the big supplements like Xanathars, Mordenkainen's, and all those, but it does not include the adventures, which the adventures do add a lot of new content. For example, they add new monsters, they add new magic items, they add new backgrounds, they add new, I don't know if they add any new, like, races or sub-races, because I think those eventually get added in other supplements, but there is new content added in, Tomb of Annihilation and Curse of Strahd and Out of the Abyss. All those things add, the back of the book includes appendices with their own new additions that you could conceivably add to any 5e campaign and not just that campaign. The designer chose to only add in content from the very first one, which is the Tyranny of Dragons, the two Horde of the Dragon Queen and the Rise of Tiamat. So you will see things added from those books, like backgrounds and monsters and things, but none of the other books. So I'm not sure, and it wouldn't be fair to say like, well, they're coming later, because those books, some of them released, at this point like 5 years ago. So I'm not sure why Tyranny of Dragons was given the kind of thumbs up and the others were not. But otherwise, that's pretty much what part 1 is. It's a whole lot of, it's lists of spells and feats and backgrounds and just, information that already exists, just in additional table forms. The familiar one's kind of useful, like this kind of stuff that I haven't seen a whole lot of, which just puts them all together, including Volo's added variant familiars you could use. So it adds like what those are and organizes them by CR value. Everything is listed in, a lot of these tables are listed in actual tables. So for like D100, I guess that's the reason why the spells weren't done, because they're not actually a table, they're just a list. But it just doesn't, this doesn't look attractive at all. This just lists and lists of very tiny words put together. I'm not a big fan. That could have been something to at least make this more attractive to look at, I feel like. So part 2 adds adventure hooks, and I believe this one includes an actual adventure as well as magic item tables. Now, adventure hooks to me are those little paragraphs at the beginning of a lot of adventures that I've reviewed, almost countless now, that are ways to get your players to go to a place and do a thing. Right, you've given them some, and that can be hard because a lot of the best ones, they make sense within the context of your big campaign or your characters, and the designer of the adventure is not going to know that. So adventure hooks tend to be more generic by definition. I don't know if what's listed here actually qualify as adventure hooks so much as like thematic world building. Or just like random events that could occur while you're traveling around. So like Icy Arctic. A meteor shoots across the sky, which, by the way, there's a meteor in almost all of these. A lot of these are copy-pasted. A body is preserved in ice. That could be an adventure, or it could just be a one-off, like you just found a body and reserved in ice. The snow is particularly deep and slows movement. An abandoned igloo is found. Strange ice sculptures are scattered around the area. So a lot of these, I just feel like these are the kind of things you would see in a random encounter that just are non-hostile, and just kind of help build up the world or add some flavor or themes, or maybe there's a trap involved or a skill check or something, or a magic item you can find. It might lead to something else, but I don't know if I would necessarily call these adventure hooks. These feel like, not that they're bad, I think a lot of them are pretty interesting and good. A lot of the urban ones, there's an angry spouse, or the party is accused of a crime or something, and you spot a figure climb out of a first floor window. Like, those can all be very fun. I wouldn't probably call these adventure hooks. I don't know what I would call them, like just random world building tools or something to that effect. Adventure hooks to me are a little more, have more meat on their bones, but it's fun to see them by different region, and it can be useful for just having things for your players to do as they're traveling around a region that isn't just a combat encounter. And if you are into doing random and combat encounters, holy crap, this is the book for you, and we'll get to that during the last portion of this book, because that's where the actual strength of the entire supplement lies. Magic item tables, pretty much copy and pasted directly from the Dungeon Master's Guide, which seems kind of egregious to me, with the exception that it adds any of the new content released from Xanathars, and I think there's a few from like the Dragon Queen storyline. And you can see mostly Xanathars all, if you recall, mostly added common level items. They're all just inserted into Magic Item Table A. But otherwise, some of these are almost just directly drawn from the Dungeon Master's Guide. So I guess it's nice to have them. It essentially just updates them is what this is. It just updates all those tables with the new content that has been released, but I still feel like we're lacking all of the new content. We're lacking all the new items from Strahd and Storm King's Thunder and all those kind of items. So Spell Scrolls, same thing. It just adds the new content from mostly from Xanathar's. I do like the cursed items section. I may be wrong on this, but I don't think there's a good section anywhere on the Dungeon Master's Guide about cursed items. It's a pretty small little thing about here's some items might be cursed, but I don't recall any information about here's how to build a cursed item or here are sample cursed item effects, which this one does provide. Which to me that's new content. I may be wrong. I tried glancing through all the books and trying to find if there was another section on cursed items, but otherwise this feels like it is new content, which we're on page 39 to get to new content, but I do like this, and some of them are very fun. Item screams when used. Wielder is compelled to apologize when they deal damage to a creature. Some of them are obviously just straight mechanically bad, like Wizard is Wielder has disadvantage on saving throws, or just disadvantage on attacks, or can no longer speak a certain language, or you keep a track in particular CR1 animal or monster to your location. I would love to have an animal or an item that just attracts like squirrels or something to you. That'd be pretty fun. But I do like that the added effort is given to cursed items that isn't just, you go mad or you take damage or something that's the usual suspects for cursed items. Weapons, items, traps, same thing. Well, traps, I don't know if we actually get a table like this anywhere that actually lists them by table. It's usually just like paragraph chunks for traps, so that actually can be kind of useful, especially because it lists them, I believe, by tier. There's simple traps, complex traps, and then also environmental hazards. So that's kind of interesting. I don't think there are tables provided. And these aren't technically tables, they're not like D20 or D100, it's just a list. But again, this list has nice colored bars. This at least looks better than this. I don't know what's wrong with the spell chart. I didn't have the colored bars on there. But that can be useful information to have because, again, it's taking in information that already exists and just giving it an at-a-glance addition. New traps are kind of nice. A lot of these, I feel like they already exist in some way or another, but it's nice to have some new content in there at least. So we finally, on page 45, get to the real meat of the new content, and that is a new adventure, which is nice to have in a supplement. A lot of things that are billed as supplements, like DM tools and stuff, they usually don't include full-on adventures. So on the one hand, that's great. On the other hand, it's not a good adventure, unfortunately. It is excessively generic. The hook for the adventure and the backstory is not that bad. It's a classic, like, this town needs a priest. A priest is traveling there. The priest gets kidnapped and killed, and an imposter essentially takes over his place. He's an evil priest and goes to the town, swindles the town out of their money, and then retreats to his lair where he does evil things. Unfortunately, the adventure starts after you already know all the information. It's almost played out like an Adventurers League mission. It's really, really short. It's only 6 pages long. And the party is tasked with going to the location. You already know where it is. You already know what's happened. And the only thing you don't really know is anything about the villain, which doesn't matter because he's just a generic evil priest villain. And you just go into this dungeon and kind of knock down a bunch of cultists. And that's pretty much the entire adventure. It's basically just a dungeon crawl, and it's, unfortunately, the dungeon crawl is excessively generic. I mean, it is, you're going through this underground lair. There's some cultists there, which is probably, cultists and bandits, and maybe, I guess, goblins are the most generic, like level 1. I should mention level 1 adventure to face. There's a very painfully classic moment where you enter a room with 4 sarcophagi, and sure enough, they open up and skeletons pop out and attack you. There's a secret door at one point. I don't believe there's any traps. And then the final room has a priest that will raise. It turns out his evil plot is turning people into zombies, which honestly feels like every other villain in the Forgotten Realms universe can just kind of raise zombies. Like, undead is not a big, shocking thing, right? Like, I don't know. First of all, I don't know why anybody would ever bury bodies in a universe where undead is a kind of commonplace thing. That's a separate hilarious rant, but it's just not, it's not memorable. It doesn't really do anything for me. It's difficult to complain about, I mean, because this whole thing feels like a bonus, but it's also just not a good adventure. The good thing is we get a map included in this adventure, and it actually goes above and beyond providing a map and provides us map tiles for building your own piece, your own dungeon out of all these different pieces, which is something that people like pay money for on Roll20 to get these pieces for. Now, I'm not sure if these are provided as like separate image files in like a zip. I was directly emailed this content, so I mean, at the very least, you could, copy paste and then crop these out and manually do it on a virtual tabletop, or obviously for a physical, old school, just cut that stuff out and build your own little map together like paper Legos. But that's cool. I like that a lot, and these pieces look great. The map itself is full color and detailed. It's got the grid board on there, and there's a ton. I mean, there's pages and pages of these pieces. That's really, really cool. So that's something I've really almost never seen included in any of these supplements. Is actual, like, we might get like a sample dungeon map, but not a sample modular dungeon map where you can actually build the pieces together. And I think that's a really cool addition to have. Part 3 and Part 4 are very similar. Part 3 is just NPCs and Part 4 is monsters, but they add tables. In this case, they add, first of all, just tables of all the NPCs together, which, again, that is stuff that is included in the monster manual, but at least here you can see where having a combination of all the things released so far is very useful, because the only the ones that say MM on here are from the original Monster Man. You get a ton of these that were added in Valos, in the Horde of the Dragon Queen, in the starter set, added some new ones. And NPCs are just essentially humanoid people that are assigned certain NPC classes, rather than monsters that operate kind of by their own rules. So that's pretty useful to have at a glance, and then it goes and puts them in different encounter tables for different regions as well as themes. So you might have like a cultist temple, what would be included in like bandits and raiders, or pirates, or a stronghold, and that's pretty useful. Now, I'm somebody that originally, when we very first started doing D&D in Lost Mine of Phandelver, I initially was rolling random encounters. That was a thing that I was doing, and then after that I dropped it and just started doing scripted random encounters. So in other words, I would pre-plan, and that's one of those is because we play on Roll20, we play on a virtual tabletop, so it's very difficult to just throw together a map and tokens and all those things in place. You want to have that stuff set, but it ends up being, I think, more narratively satisfying. Without going on a rant, I'll just say that the way I play D&D is we don't use random encounters. I'm not rolling like a D20 and then rolling like 3d6 wolves or something that attacks you. I am pre-planning all these encounters, making sure they're meaningful, they make sense in the context of the story, or where they're just certain monsters I want the players to fight that add some good world building or something. So these tables aren't useful for me for that reason, but what they can be useful for, and we'll get to that in Part 4 also, is knowing what kind of creatures and maybe what kind of groups of creatures that would be helpful to have in an encounter in certain regions. And those regions are played out in Part 4, which Part 4 includes over 60 pages of random encounter tables, which is the most I have definitely ever seen in any product. And this pulls together, again, all those monsters from all those supplements that I mentioned, minus the actual 5e campaign adventures, and puts them in all of these different locations, settings, planes of existence, and dungeons. So it's not just, because Xanathar's does this already. Xanathar's has a chapter that includes monsters by region. They're not as big at tables as these are. I think there are maybe 10 spaces total, and they'll be like, here's Arctic, here's coastal, here's forest, here's desert, just kind of what monsters you would see. And they're not, they're not like paragraphs of encounters, they're just one line. It's like, 2d6 peritons or something. This one does more tables and goes way further when it comes to actual regions and themes. So yes, you've got like plains and forests and deserts. You've also got lycanthrope clans. You've got starspawn incursions, gnoll war bands. There's a drow colony. There's Kuatoa domains, mind flayer sanctums, kobold layers, dwerger caverns, tropical lands, mountains, land dinosaurs, orc tribes. I mean, I'm just going through. There's elemental planes, Githyanki raiders, the astral plane, the Shadowfell, the Feywild. literally pretty much every single zone or territory you could possibly think of, there is an encounter table provided here. And again, for me, I'm not interested in actually rolling these encounter tables and determining, okay, well, you're walking through the Feywild, so I'm going to roll a D100 and see what appears. That's not how I play or how I plan D&D. But what is useful for me is knowing what kind of creatures are actually in those zones, and at least according to this designer, maybe which one of those creatures can appear in like combinations of each other, or that would be rated by CR value, so I can instantly get a glance of like, okay, if my characters are tier 1 or tier 3, what kind of creature should they be facing and what makes sense for them in this zone. This does provide that, which is very, very helpful. So not only does it do a fun job of organizing all of those creatures into these various zones, but it's useful just to determine like what kind of creatures are you going to see, how powerful those creatures are, and just any kind of zone you could possibly want. And that's basically, I think, a third of this or over a third of what this supplement is. So initially I was very, very lukewarm on what this supplement was giving me in terms of, because I'm looking for, new content, new useful content that I can use. And a lot of it is just, giving me tables of stuff that I already knew for the most part, just providing it in a single table. Yes, some of them are useful, but a lot of them are just information I didn't necessarily need to have all combined in a table. But this is very helpful. This is very, very useful for me as somebody who is, yes, I'm aware of these creatures, but maybe not aware of where they all fit into various zones and layers and locations. And it can be extremely helpful for me if my players are in a certain kind of dungeon, the Slime Pit's Abyssal Lair, the Demon Web Pit's Abyssal Lair, like very specific areas on which creatures to use, which to draw in there, and how they play out in terms of their CR value in relation to one another can be very, very helpful. So huge thumbs up on this section, thankfully, because this section kind of, in my opinion, saves the document from being, frankly, mostly mediocre to being actually extremely useful if you find this information useful, which is organizing monsters by location and CR value. So if you're big into using a lot of, if you're big into filling out, exotic or interesting new areas, or even just, again, you've got desert, you've got swamp, you've got more generic ones, and just want those monsters at a glance, this can be extremely helpful for that and offers probably more tables and things than I've ever seen a supplement provide. All right, let's go over my pros and cons for the Babbling Wizards Guide to Reality. Pros, just mentioned that, over 60 pages of encounter tables for every type of environment and dungeon. Holy crap. Literally anything you could possibly, any area you can think of. I would probably challenge someone to come up with an area that is not mentioned here, or a layer or a dungeon or a location or anything that exists within the Forgotten Realms universe that is not listed here and has a table of creatures involved, which goes to show you the strength and breadth of creatures already existing, and it's useful to have that information presented in such a way. Pros, I really like the cursed items effect. I don't believe that has ever been expanded on. That was which is something I was hoping the supplement would do more of, is find those holes that exist within existing supplements and then provide that new content. The cursed items is unfortunately one of the only examples of a section that the Babbling Wizard successfully does, unless I'm missing somewhere that all that cursed item stuff exists somewhere in the existing material. And pro, I love that the adventure includes a full color grid battle map with modular tiles to be able to build your own dungeon out of it. That's a huge plus that I rarely see. I mean, I rarely see maps in general, so I'm always ecstatic. I'm easily seduced by good maps. People that watch these reviews know that from me. And the fact that you're giving me not only that map, but also the tools to build my own little map is absolutely delightful. Cons, I tried to summarize my main con with this adventure in that it really lacks new content. And I don't think that was necessarily the idea. The foreword and the introduction stuff basically says that was the point of this entire product, was not necessarily to provide new content, but to assist in bringing all that existing content into a single living document that would be easier to see all that stuff at a glance. And my response is, okay, that's fine, but I need a little bit more than that from a product that is going to be purchased on the DM's Guild, because again, the internet exists, websites exist, like it's not that hard to look up that information. I mean, people have tablets and phones at the table, like you can look up whatever information you need without that much trouble. So you really need to go above and beyond in creating either adding new content or providing that content in such an attractive, amazing format. And I don't think this quite does that. And the other con is, it upsets me to do this because it is a bonus that we even get an adventure, but the adventure is just not that good. It's very generic. It's very forgettable. It's a shame that we skipped ahead of the what might have been an interesting like story part of the plot and just get right to the dungeon crawl, and the dungeon crawl was not great. It's a bummer because it's just not a very good, well-designed adventure. Final verdict, the Babbling Wizard mostly relies on and combines existing 5e content to build dozens of helpful tables, including monster encounters for every kind of dungeon and location you could ever want. Thank you for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson, and you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.